On June 15, 2022, Microsoft finally pulled the plug on Internet Explorer. The immediate result was not nostalgia, but panic. Across America, aging hospital systems, corporate back offices, and ATM networks suddenly faced the threat of dark screens. 2 decades earlier, that blue E icon held a staggering 95% of the global market. It was the undisputed default window to the web for an entire generation. But by its final day, it had become a cultural punchline, a ridiculed piece of software holding on with single-digit relevance. Millions of users had long since moved on, but thousands of American businesses realized their essential, unseen infrastructure was fatally tied to a dead browser. The paradox is that Internet Explorer did not die because it failed to access the internet. It died because it could not keep up with the speed of the ecosystem it once entirely controlled. But the real story of Internet Explorer is not only the story of its overdue death. It is the story of how America bought the future in a retail box, installed it on a beige desktop, and let one company decide what the internet should look like. Every week, we tell the stories of American devices, platforms, software, stores, and screens that once taught the country what the future felt like, and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story of Internet Explorer begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place in Redmond, Washington in 1995. In the early months of 1995, the American personal computer was an isolated machine. Across the country, family desks, college dorm rooms, and office cubicles were dominated by heavy beige desktop towers and deep, glowing CRT monitors. These machines were powerful, but they were largely self-contained islands. You used an operating system, the core software that manages the computer and lets other programs run, to open local files. You wrote documents, played CD-ROM games, or ran spreadsheets. If you wanted to add new capabilities to the machine, you drove to a mall electronics store, walked down a software aisle, and bought a physical cardboard box containing floppy disks or a CD. The internet existed, but it was not a default American destination. It was a friction-heavy realm reserved for university researchers, enterprise networks, or hobbyists navigating text-based bulletin board systems. There was no single obvious window to the World Wide Web installed on the average American hard drive. Then, a startup in Silicon Valley changed the geography of the digital world. Netscape Communications released Netscape Navigator. It was a browser, software used to view websites, that finally gave the internet a clean, graphical interface. Suddenly, ordinary people could see pictures and formatted text online. But Netscape treated the browser like traditional software. They put it in a box. In stores like CompUSA and Circuit City, Americans were paying around $39 to buy a copy of Netscape Navigator. By the spring of 1995, Netscape commanded over 70% of the browser market. They were defining what the internet looked like, and they were doing it entirely outside the control of the company that owned the American desktop. 2,000 miles away in Redmond, Washington, Microsoft was caught entirely off guard. For years, Microsoft had focused heavily on dominating the local machine. They were preparing to launch Windows 95, an operating system that would revolutionize the user interface with the Start button and the taskbar. But inside the Microsoft campus, a panic was quietly setting in. Bill Gates realized that if Netscape controlled the browser, and the browser became the primary way people used their computers, the underlying Windows operating system would eventually become irrelevant. Netscape was trying to turn the browser into a platform, a technology system that other products, developers, users, or services build around. If software developers started writing programs specifically for the Netscape browser, it would not matter if the user was running Windows, a Macintosh, or a Unix machine. Microsoft's core monopoly was suddenly in existential danger. On May 26, 1995, Gates authored an internal memorandum titled The Internet tidal wave. He assigned the Internet the highest level of importance within the company, declaring it the most significant development since the IBM PC. Microsoft had to build a browser, and they had to do it immediately. But writing a complex piece of software from scratch took time, and the market was moving too fast. To catch the tidal wave, Microsoft needed a shortcut. They licensed source code from Spyglass, an early software company that had commercialized the pioneering Mosaic browser. Using this rented foundation, a small team of Microsoft engineers scrambled to piece together the company's first official window to the web. They called it Internet Explorer. The American entry of Internet Explorer 1.0 was not a grand standalone revolution. It was quiet, slightly clumsy, and buried inside a retail bundle. When Windows 95 officially launched on August 24, 1995, it was accompanied by a massive, multi-million-dollar marketing campaign featuring the Rolling Stones and late-night television commercials. But Internet Explorer 1.0 was not built directly into the base version of Windows 95. Instead, it was included in the Windows 95 Plus pack, an optional retail add-on sold for $49.99. An American consumer who wanted Microsoft's new browser had to go to a retail shelf at Best Buy or Office Depot, buy the Plus pack, bring the box home, and feed floppy disks into their computer. The early reception of Internet Explorer 1.0 was underwhelming. At barely 1 megabyte in size, the software was painfully basic. When an American user connected their modem, a device that let computers send data over phone lines, and dialed into the web using IE 1.0, the experience was heavily compromised. The browser could not display complex graphics properly. It did not support the advanced HTML tables or background colors that web developers were already using for Netscape. Pages looked broken or misaligned. To developers and early adopters, Internet Explorer was viewed as a poor imitation, a rushed product from a corporate giant that simply did not understand Internet culture. Available records suggest that in its first few months, Internet Explorer captured less than 3% of the market. Netscape was running away with the future, and their initial public offering in August 1995 made them the undisputed darling of Silicon Valley. Microsoft was a Goliath, but on the Internet, they were losing to a startup. However, the engineers in Redmond were not bound by the need to turn a profit on a $39 software box. Because Microsoft's true revenue came from selling the Windows operating system to computer manufacturers like Compaq, Dell, and Gateway, they could afford to treat the browser as a loss leader. By November 1995, Microsoft released Internet Explorer 2.0. It was a functional improvement, finally adding support for features like SSL security and newsgroups. But more importantly, it signaled a shift in strategy. Microsoft made IE 2.0 free to download for all Windows users, removing the requirement to buy the Retail Plus pack. The first crack in Netscape's armor was not written in code. It was written in retail economics. Netscape relied on selling the browser to survive. Microsoft could give it away forever to protect its operating system. The browser was ready. But to take the internet from Netscape, Microsoft realized they did not need to build a better software box. They just needed to own the desk. In August 1996, Microsoft released Internet Explorer 3.0. For the first time, the engineers in Redmond had produced a piece of software that could genuinely stand shoulder to shoulder with Netscape Navigator. It introduced support for CSS, cascading style sheets, a coding language that let developers tightly control the visual layout, colors, and fonts of web pages. Suddenly, a developer in a Silicon Valley startup or a computer science student in a university lab could build a website that looked less like a plain text document and more like a structured magazine page. The browser also supported ActiveX, a Microsoft technology that allowed web pages to run small, interactive programs directly on the user's machine. Technically, the playing field was leveling, but building a competitive browser was only half the battle. Netscape still held massive cultural gravity and commanding market share. If an American consumer wanted to get on the internet in 1996, they usually drove to a mall, walked into a specialized software retailer like Egghead Software or Babbage's, and browsed the physical aisles. There, Netscape Navigator sat in a glossy, shrink-wrapped cardboard box, complete with a printed manual and a price tag. Microsoft understood that they could not win a traditional retail war against a beloved brand. Instead, they weaponized their absolute monopoly over the personal computer to change the rules of how software was distributed. This was the ultimate execution of Market Force number 2, distribution, defaults, and platform access. Microsoft decided to make the browser completely invisible to the cash register. First, they targeted the internet service providers. In the mid-1990s, most Americans did not have broadband internet. They used dial-up connections provided by companies like America Online, commonly known as AOL. AOL was a massive cultural force, famous for blanketing the United States with millions of free trial CD-ROMs sent through the mail, tucked into magazines, and handed out at Blockbuster video stores. In a ruthless and brilliant business maneuver, Microsoft offered AOL a deal. If AOL agreed to make Internet Explorer its primary built-in browser, Microsoft would place an AOL installation folder directly on the desktop of the Windows operating system. It was a masterclass in controlling the default setting, the pre-selected option that a system uses automatically unless a user actively digs into menus to change it. When a family in a suburban American living room put an AOL disk into their computer, waded through the screeching static of the dial-up modem, and finally connected to the web, they were no longer making a conscious choice about which browser to use. They were simply handed the blue E. The second phase of the breakthrough was even more aggressive. In September 1997, Microsoft released Internet Explorer 4.0. To celebrate, a group of Microsoft employees famously sneaked onto Netscape's corporate campus in Mountain View, California, in the middle of the night and dropped a giant 10-foot-tall metal E logo directly on their rival's front lawn. It was a prank, but it signaled a very real and devastating shift in the industry. With version 4.0, Microsoft did not just bundle the browser alongside other programs. They wove the code directly into the fabric of the Windows operating system itself. A feature called Active Desktop allowed web content to be displayed directly on the user's main computer screen, blurring the line between local files and internet pages. When Windows 98 launched the following year, this strategy reached its absolute peak. The browser was no longer a distinct application that a user could easily uninstall. It was bolted into the core architecture of the machine. If an IT administrator at an American high school or a corporate office tried to remove Internet Explorer, parts of the Windows operating system could simply break. The file manager used to look at local hard drives, and the browser used to look at the Internet, were essentially running on the same underlying engine. This deep integration completely bypassed the traditional retail software aisle. Why would an American consumer drive to a Circuit City, navigate the crowded shelves, and pay $39 for a boxed copy of Netscape when an equally capable browser was already waiting for them the exact moment they booted up their brand new Gateway or Dell Tower? The pricing model of the digital world had been permanently altered. The browser went from being a distinct premium software product to a free, assumed utility, like a steering wheel in a newly purchased car. Netscape could not survive competing against a product that was both completely free and physically unavoidable. Their primary source of revenue collapsed almost overnight. By early 1998, they were forced to make their own browser free to download, but the ecosystem damage had already been done. Web developers, the vital network of programmers building the internet, began looking at the shifting market share. Seeing millions of Windows machines shipping with Microsoft software pre-installed, they started optimizing their websites specifically for Internet Explorer. Soon, pages across the early web began displaying tiny badges that read, "Best viewed in Internet Explorer." The integration was so aggressive that it triggered a massive legal backlash. In 1998, the United States Department of Justice filed a landmark antitrust lawsuit against Microsoft, accusing the tech giant of illegally using its operating system monopoly to crush Netscape and restrict consumer choice. But while the lawyers and executives argued in federal courtrooms, the American public had already moved on. The concept of the browser was losing its standalone identity. To an entire generation of Americans moving a mouse across a beige desk, they were not launching a specific piece of software called Internet Explorer. They were simply opening the Internet. By making the browser invisible to the cash register, Microsoft destroyed their rival, but the victory set up a trap they could not yet see. By the turn of the millennium, the first browser war was over. Netscape was effectively dead, having been sold off to AOL in a desperate retreat, and Microsoft had achieved a level of software dominance rarely seen in American industrial history. When Internet Explorer 5's Explorer 5 launched in 1999, and subsequently Internet Explorer 6 in August 2001, they were not just popular programs, they were the undisputed infrastructure of the digital world. This era represented the absolute peak of Microsoft's power over the Internet. When Windows XP launched into the American market, ushering in an age of bright green hills on desktop wallpapers and a more colorful, consumer-friendly interface, it carried Internet Explorer 6 locked tightly inside its core. For the American consumer, the Internet was no longer a separate, boxed product you had to deliberately install. It was simply the blue E, sitting on the taskbar of every new gateway, Dell, Compaq, and HP computer sold at Best Buy or Circuit City. In an American house where the family computer once sat in a shared room, that blue icon did not merely run web pages. It decided who could go online, who could shop, who could chat, and who felt that the Internet had finally arrived. At its peak in the early 2000s, industry trackers estimated that Internet Explorer held a staggering 95% of the global browser market. But this monopoly was not held by consumer choice alone. It was secured by an iron grip on the developer ecosystem. This was the ultimate realization of market force number 3, network effects and developer support. Because Internet Explorer was on nearly every desktop, web developers, the programmers building the early infrastructure for online banking, shopping, and corporate portals, stopped trying to make their websites work for everyone. They built them exclusively for Microsoft. To achieve this, Microsoft pushed proprietary technologies like ActiveX, a software framework that allowed websites to download and run small programs directly on a Windows computer. If a bank in New York or a school district in Texas wanted to build a secure internal portal, they built it using ActiveX. But ActiveX was not an open internet standard. It only worked on Windows, and it only worked through Internet Explorer. If a user attempted to access one of these websites using an alternative browser or a different operating system, the site would simply break. Images would fail to load, buttons would not click, and text would scatter across the screen. To navigate the web in 2002 meant surrendering to Microsoft's ecosystem. The browser had become synonymous with the Internet itself. Inside American office cubicles and corporate IT departments, Internet Explorer 6 became the mandatory standard. Entire enterprise systems, payroll software, inventory management, hospital records, and human resources portals were hard-coded to function exclusively within that single browser version. It was a massive, quiet standardization of American commerce. Even Apple, still recovering from its near collapse in the late 1990s, had been forced to bow to this reality. As part of a 1997 financial settlement and investment deal with Microsoft, Apple agreed to make Internet Explorer the default browser on the Macintosh. For a brief, surreal window of time, even Steve Jobs' hardware directed users to the web through Bill Gates' software. The strategy of deep bundling and proprietary standards had worked flawlessly. Microsoft had successfully defended its operating system monopoly by capturing the very platform that threatened it. But achieving 95% market share creates a dangerous corporate illusion. When a company owns the entire market, there is no one left to fight, and the urgency to build the future suddenly vanishes. By 2002, the physical landscape of American technology retail had fundamentally shifted. If you walked into a Circuit City or a CompUSA, the software aisles were still packed with oversized cardboard boxes for PC games, encyclopedias, and productivity suites. But the browser box was gone. The war for internet access was no longer fought on the store shelf. It was pre-decided at the factory. Millions of beige gateway towers, shipped in their famous cow-spotted boxes, arrived on American porches with the internet already loaded and waiting behind a single blue icon. Internet Explorer 6 was not merely successful, it was the absolute, unquestioned lens through which the country experienced a digital revolution. This was the era when the American internet was shifting from a novelty to a utility. As households slowly began upgrading to broadband, a high-capacity transmission technology that kept computers connected to the internet constantly, without the need for screeching dial-up modems. The Blue E was always open. It was the window for checking early Yahoo email accounts, browsing eBay listings, and reading the news after the tragedy of September 11th. In public libraries and university computer labs across the country, rows of heavy CRT monitors displayed the exact same interface. The browser's dominance was so absolute that it fundamentally altered how the internet was built. The World Wide Web Consortium, an international organization designed to maintain open standards for HTML, the foundational coding language used to structure web pages, found its guidelines repeatedly ignored. Microsoft did not need to follow open standards. They were the standard. If an American small business wanted to sell products online, they hired a web designer. And that designer did not test the website to see if it worked on a Macintosh or on a Linux machine or on alternative browsers. They tested it on Internet Explorer 6. If it worked there, it worked for 95% of the country. Web pages regularly featured a tiny, pixelated graphic at the bottom of the screen reading, "Best viewed in Internet Explorer." It was not a marketing slogan, it was a technical warning. This total control reached its deepest roots inside corporate America. Companies began building massive intranets, private, secure networks contained within an enterprise to share internal tools, HR portals, and payroll systems. Because IT departments bought Windows computers in bulk, they built these internal tools specifically to run on ActiveX and Internet Explorer. From the checkout registers at major retail chains to the back office terminals of American hospitals, the browser was inextricably woven into the operational infrastructure of the United States economy. The software was free, but its true value to Microsoft was immeasurable. It served as a massive, unassailable moat around the Windows operating system. As long as the internet only functioned correctly through Internet Explorer, no competitor could ever convince an American consumer or business to buy a different type of computer. But absolute market dominance often breeds a very specific kind of corporate blindness. By 2003, Microsoft had successfully weathered the worst of the Department of Justice's antitrust lawsuit. They were not broken up. They retained their operating system monopoly. Netscape was a ghost. To the executives in Redmond, the browser war was not just won, it was entirely over. They viewed the internet as a completed project, a static, solved problem that simply required maintenance, not innovation. In a decision that would later be viewed as one of the greatest unforced errors in Silicon Valley history, Microsoft effectively disbanded the core Internet Explorer development team. The engineers and programmers who had built the most used piece of software in human history were reassigned to other projects, primarily to work on the next version of the Windows operating system. Internet Explorer 6 would not receive a major, standalone update for more than 5 years. In the fast-moving digital economy, a 5-year freeze is an eternity. The Blue E sat completely still on the taskbar of every American desktop, unchallenged and unchanged. The company assumed that because they owned the default setting, they owned the future permanently. But in an American house where the family computer once sat in a shared room, that blue icon did not merely run web pages. It decided who could go online, who could shop, who could chat, and who felt that the internet had finally arrived. That same total control would later become the trap. The first crack in the Internet Explorer empire did not look like a technological revolution. It looked like a pop-up advertisement. By 2003, the internet was rapidly evolving from a digital library of static text pages into a dynamic, interactive space. It was the dawn of Web 2.0, a period when websites began acting more like fully functional applications. But while the web moved forward, the American desktop was stuck in 2001. Because Microsoft had essentially disbanded the core Internet Explorer team after achieving a 95% market share, the browser was not actively adapting. It was sitting idle, and that stagnation turned its greatest strength into a massive vulnerability. The core of the problem was ActiveX, the proprietary technology Microsoft used to let websites run small programs directly on a local machine. During the corporate adoption phase, ActiveX was the glue that held enterprise networks together. But on the open, public internet, it was a profound security risk. Malicious actors quickly realized that because Internet Explorer 6 was deeply integrated into the Windows operating system itself, compromising the browser meant gaining direct access to the entire computer. The consequences played out in nearly every American family computer room. A user might click a seemingly harmless link to download a screensaver or a music file, and ActiveX would silently execute malicious code in the background. Suddenly, the beige desktop tower would slow to a crawl. The screen would be bombarded with endless, cascading pop-up advertisements. The browser's home page would be hijacked, redirecting users to unfamiliar, scam-laden search engines. This introduced an entirely new physical aesthetic to the American monitor, the toolbar plague. In an attempt to add features that Microsoft refused to build, third-party companies began offering downloadable browser toolbars. Soon, the top half of an Internet Explorer 6 window on a bulky CRT monitor was choked with 5 or 6 stacked rows of search bars, Ask Jeeves, Yahoo, weather trackers, and shopping assistants, leaving only a tiny square of glass at the bottom to actually view the internet. The blue E icon was no longer just a window to the web. For millions of frustrated users, it became synonymous with spyware, computer viruses, and a degraded digital experience. This environment perfectly illustrated the collapse of market force number 3, network effects and developer support. A platform needs developers to build upon it, but developers were beginning to actively despise Internet Explorer. Programmers who were trying to build the modern web were discovering that IE6 was a nightmare to work with. It was notoriously non-compliant with standard web coding languages. If a developer in a Silicon Valley startup wanted a website to look modern, with rounded corners, transparent images, or interactive menus, they had to write the code twice. They wrote one clean version for the emerging global web standards, and they wrote a separate, complex, heavily patched version solely to force the layout to work in Internet Explorer 6. The resentment in the developer community reached a boiling point. The people who actually built the internet were spending half their working hours fixing bugs caused by a 5-year-old browser that Microsoft refused to update. They desperately wanted an alternative, and in 2004, a non-profit organization named Mozilla delivered one. They released Firefox. Firefox was a browser built by developers, for developers, and it introduced features that immediately made Internet Explorer feel ancient. Chief among them was tabbed browsing, an interface feature that lets users open multiple web pages inside a single application window. Before tabs, an American user researching a school paper or comparing prices across 3 different retail websites had to open 3 entirely separate Internet Explorer windows. The taskbar at the bottom of the Windows screen would become a cluttered, unreadable mess of overlapping blue rectangles. Firefox cleaned up the desktop, putting everything neatly at the top of a single window. It also included a built-in pop-up blocker, instantly curing one of the most visible headaches of the early 2000s Internet. Firefox did not immediately destroy Internet Explorer's market share, but it caused a lethal, invisible shift. It siphoned off the early adopters. The computer science students, the office IT administrators, and the neighborhood tech enthusiasts who usually fixed their family's computers began downloading Firefox. When an American college student went home for Thanksgiving in 2005, one of their first actions was often sitting down at the family computer in the living room, opening Internet Explorer, using it to download Firefox, and telling their parents to never click the blue E again. Microsoft finally recognized the threat and scrambled to rebuild their browser team. In late 2006, they released Internet Explorer 7. It finally added tabbed browsing and tightened security. But the update was reactive, not proactive. Microsoft was no longer defining the future of the Internet. They were simply trying to patch the holes in their aging monopoly. The browser wars had officially restarted. Internet Explorer still had the vast majority of the market because it retained the default position on Windows computers. But relying solely on a default setting is dangerous when users are actively annoyed by the product. Microsoft had finally updated the software, but they were about to face an opponent that did not just want to change the browser. It wanted to index the entire Internet, and it had the financial power to change American habits forever. While the developer exodus and the rise of Firefox had cracked the foundation of Microsoft's browser monopoly, the fatal blow to Internet Explorer came not from another desktop application, but from a device that fit entirely in the palm of an American hand. This marked the full, crushing acceleration of market force number 4, smartphone, cloud, streaming, and convenience displacement. On June 29, 2007, Apple released the iPhone. In carrier stores like AT&T outlets across the United States, lines wrapped around buildings as Americans waited to buy a glass-fronted device that combined calling, music, apps, and web browsing into a single pocket-sized computer. The mobile phone did not just compete with existing electronics, it absorbed them entirely. For internet browsing, the iPhone introduced Safari, a fast, touch-optimized browser that rendered web pages smoothly without requiring desktop plugins or complex software patches. Simultaneously, Google released Chrome in September 2008. Chrome approached the web with a radically different philosophy. Instead of treating the browser as a minor accessory to an operating system, Google treated the browser itself as the operating system. Each browser tab ran in its own isolated memory process, fast temporary storage a computer uses while programs are running, meaning that if one website crashed, the entire application did not freeze. Chrome was lean, lightning fast, and minimalist, stripping away the cluttered toolbars and heavy menus that had bloated Internet Explorer for years. The distribution advantage that Microsoft had spent a decade building suddenly inverted into a trap. For years, Internet Explorer's primary strength was that it was pre-installed on every Windows computer. But now, when an American consumer bought a new laptop at Best Buy, or unpacked a sleek new MacBook, or pulled an iPhone out of its box, they opened Internet Explorer just long enough to perform one specific humiliating ritual. They typed "download Google Chrome" into the address bar, downloaded a rival browser, and dragged the blue E icon into the recycling bin forever. The software that once owned 95% of the internet was reduced to a download vehicle for its own executioners. Corporate America, which had spent a decade locking its internal systems to Internet Explorer 6, found itself caught in a painful technological trap. Hospitals, banks, and government agencies could not easily upgrade their legacy systems, older technology still in use after the market has moved to newer systems, because rewriting decades of ActiveX code would cost millions of dollars. They were trapped inside a secure, brittle digital cage of their own making, forced to run an unpatched, vulnerable browser simply to keep payroll running and patient records accessible. The developer community, meanwhile, had completely abandoned the ecosystem. Programming forums mocked Internet Explorer daily. Memes circulated across the early web depicting the blue E as an elderly, confused relic wandering through a modern digital landscape. By 2010, the decline was absolute and irreversible. Microsoft launched subsequent updates like Internet Explorer 9, 10, and 11, striving desperately to modernize the rendering engine, clean up the interface, and regain web standards compliance. But user trust cannot be patched with a software update. The habit was gone. The browser was no longer a portal of discovery. It was an obstacle to be avoided. The shelf changed, the apps stopped updating. The users moved, the developers followed. The store closed, the logo remained, the habit was gone. Today, the blue E icon is completely gone from active desktop tasks, having been permanently replaced by Microsoft Edge across modern Windows updates. Internet Explorer now exists primarily as a punchline in internet culture, a meme about slowness, an ancient window that was only ever open to download another browser. Yet its technical ghost continues to haunt the infrastructure of the American economy. Because thousands of corporate networks, state government portals, and hospital billing systems were hard-coded around ActiveX in the early 2000s, Microsoft was forced to build a specialized feature known as IE Mode directly inside the Edge browser. This hidden compatibility engine allows modern computers to emulate the behavior of a dead browser, ensuring that legacy financial systems and old administrative records do not completely collapse. Microsoft has committed to supporting this digital crutch through the late 2020s, meaning an obsolete piece of software from 2001 is legally and technically guaranteed to outlive many of the workers who originally installed it. This afterlife is carefully documented by preservationists and enthusiasts. On collector forums, vintage computer hobbyists restore Windows XP machines to their original configurations, intentionally browsing archives of old websites using the native rendering engine just to experience what the web felt like before it was packaged into sleek, mobile application feeds. At the Computer History Museum in Mountain View, California, early promotional materials and software releases from the browser wars sit behind glass cases, serving as physical proof of an era when corporate competition was fought not with apps or cloud servers, but through the operating system desktop itself. The story of Internet Explorer is a sobering reminder of a fundamental law of digital technology. Holding the default position is not a permanent guarantee of survival. A company can capture 95% of the market. It can bundle its software into every machine shipped across a nation. It can outmaneuver its startup rivals in the courtroom and on the retail shelf. But if it stops innovating, stops listening to developers, and assumes that user habits cannot change, the market will quietly engineer a way around it. Internet Explorer taught America how to look at the internet, how to shop online, and how to build a digital life through a single window. But it also proved that when a platform becomes too arrogant to evolve, the millions of users who once depended on it will happily turn it into a stepping stone for something better. Somewhere in the back office of an American warehouse, a beige desktop tower still hums, running an unpatched operating system where a blue E sits on the taskbar, waiting to render a web page from a vanished era. See you in the next one.